So on page 52, after the 1,000 years has ended, Satan will be loosed from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, and gather them for battle. Please notice that the battle of Gog and Magog does not happen until after the 1,000 years, after Satan has been released. That's very, very important and should be noted. This battle was Satan's last pitiful attempt to overthrow the kingdom, which he fails miserably at. Fire rains down from heaven and devours them. Satan is finally cast into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet are. And so we're going to continue 52 through 53. Now, honestly, I had no clue what to do with Ezekiel 38 and 39 when I initially put the PDF together. That's why they appeared on page 53 the way it did. These two chapters required more understanding I simply just didn't have at that time. And the reason this was placed around the time Satan is released after the 1,000 years is because of the details that were provided in Ezekiel 38 verses 1 through 20, which deals with Gog. And these verses, it deals with the children of Israel dwelling safely in their land. Isaiah 60 tells us about the children of Israel dwelling safely in their land. We know the whole nation of Israel will never dwell safely in the land again like they did before until Yeshua comes and brings them back into the land. During that time, they'll study war no more, and the gates will be open continually day and night. But Isaiah 60 does mention walls. See, things like that can throw you off a bit. Now, I don't believe scripture contradicts itself. It just means that there is something that I don't understand. So I stopped there, but I placed it in the same ballpark as the beast being released after the 1,000 years because of all the other details provided. Again, Satan is released after the 1,000-year reign, not one day before, not on the 999th year, but after the 1,000 years. Therefore, this sets precedence for another timeline. After the 1,000 years, there are some more things that have to happen before eternity begins, such as the Great White Throne Judgment and the marriage supper of the Lamb. Again, this is after the 1,000 years. But the reason I point this out is because it requires us to have more understanding about the events that transpire after the 1,000 years. So, as addressed previously, after the 1,000 years, Satan is released and goes out to the four corners of the earth and to Gog and Magog. There is yet another failed attempt against Yeshua, his people, and his city. Ezekiel 39 tells us what happens to Gog's army. It tells us that Magog will be burned with fire. This scene matches Revelation chapter 20, verse 7 through 10. As we continue in Ezekiel 39, we see what happens after the battle of Gog and Magog. The battle that happens after the 1,000 years. After the 1,000 years is really key. It's a time marker. We see that after the battle of Gog and Magog, it will take the children of Israel a period of 7 years to destroy their weapons. When you examine Ezekiel 39:21, it starts with the word and, not then. Then makes it clear that an event happened and then something followed. But in Ezekiel 39, verses 1 through 20, after talking about what will happen to Gog and Magog's army, the next set of verses shift gears, and it talks about Israel's restoration. We know from studying other verses, Israel is restored first, and the 1,000 years begins. And after the 1,000 years, Satan is set free to gather Gog and Magog for battle against Israel. So, with that understanding of other scriptural verses, Ezekiel 39 does not appear to be listed in order. That's not any different from the book of Revelation not being listed in order. So to obtain proper and clear understanding of the order, you must search through other scripture to find the timeline. Also, something else to point out. Scripture tells us that after the 1,000 years, Satan is loosed to gather the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to battle. According to Scripture, we are able to establish that this happens after the 1,000 years. But what we overlook is how long it took Satan to gather the nations, to include Gog and Magog, to battle against Yeshua. It doesn't say, but that's the point. It never says, which means it could be 1 day, 1 week, 1 year, or 100 years. We don't know. This is important to note because there is still a sense of time that happens after the 1,000 years. So it looks like that timelessness and eternity may not begin until after the Great White Throne Judgment. So after the 1,000 years, but before the Great White Throne Judgment, there appears to still be time because it took the Israelites 7 years to destroy the weapons. So in other words, after the 1,000-year reign, we have no clue how long it took for Satan to gather the nations for battle. What we do know is that after that battle, it took the Israelites 7 years to destroy and bury weapons. So it sounds to me that we've found yet another time gap from after the 1,000 years, the gathering for Gog and Magog to battle, to the time it took the Israelites to destroy the weapons, which was 7 years. Now after that, what we know is it leads into the Great White Throne Judgment and so on. These are just things I see when I examine Ezekiel 38 and 39. I feel that I'm gradually understanding these things more now, even as I've been putting this video together actually. But this is why sometimes we have to back away from Scripture and then revisit it at a later time. It allows us the time needed to develop a deeper understanding from other Scripture that then allows us to revisit passages with a better understanding than what we initially started with. Okay, and lastly, we're pretty much at the end. We have page 53, the Great White Throne Judgment. So after the 1,000 years, when Satan is released to gather the nations for battle, then there will be a Great White Throne Judgment. So we already talked about a lot of stuff that happens in between these two events. Again, Scripture does not tell how long of a time gap that will be from the end of the 1,000 years to the failed battle of Gog and Magog, to the 7 years it takes for Israel to bury the weapons, to the Great White Throne Judgment. And finally, we are at the end, page 53 through 56. After the Great White Throne Judgment, there was a new heaven and a new earth, and the new city Jerusalem came down adorned as a bride for her husband, a city designed with 12 tribes of Israel in mind, a holy city for the chosen people, the 12 tribes of Israel. And we know this from reading other passages of Scripture. Also, we see the great multitude of guests called to the marriage supper of the Lamb and his bride, Israel. Shalom. Thank you so much. And that is the end of my thought process and studying of Scripture and how this all came to be. Thank you again for all of your patience. I really appreciate it. Shalom mishpachah.